Imagine you are standing on a rooftop in Tel Aviv at 2 in the morning. The sky to the east begins to hum, not like thunder, not like a storm rolling in from the sea, something different, something mechanical and relentless and growing louder by the second. Then the sirens start. Then the interceptors launch, streaking upward like white fingers clawing at the dark. Then the explosions begin, some high above you, some not high enough, and suddenly the most sophisticated air defense architecture ever assembled by a modern nation-state is fighting for its life against an enemy it spent 20 years underestimating. That is not a dramatization. That is the strategic reality the Middle East has now entered, and it is one that nobody in Washington, Jerusalem, or Brussels was truly prepared to face. Tonight we are going to go deep into what actually happened, what it means for the balance of power in the region, and why the assumptions that have governed Western military planning for decades may be fatally broken. Stay with me because the next 15 minutes will change the way you see this conflict entirely. For years, the dominant assumption in Western strategic circles was simple. Iran is loud, Iran is provocative, but Iran knows where the red lines are. Iran would rattle its missiles, fire off threatening rhetoric, maybe push proxies into action in Yemen or Lebanon or Iraq, but it would never cross the threshold of direct large-scale military confrontation with Israel. That assumption was the load-bearing wall of Middle East deterrence theory. And it has now collapsed. The moment Iran launched a coordinated mass drone and missile campaign directly at Israeli territory, it did not just cross a red line. It erased the entire concept of where those lines were supposed to exist. The psychological impact of that alone is enormous, and it is something the casualty figures and interception percentages in the news do not fully capture. When a country decides to conduct a direct military strike against another country that is backed unconditionally by the world's most powerful military alliance, that country is making a statement that goes far beyond the tactical exchange itself. It is saying that the deterrence architecture you built, the one you spent decades reinforcing with aid packages and arms deals and security guarantees, is no longer sufficient to govern my behavior. That is a profound and dangerous message, and the fact that it has now been sent openly changes the entire strategic landscape. Let us talk about the architecture of what Iran actually deployed, because understanding the technical logic of the attack is essential to understanding why it was so strategically significant, regardless of how many projectiles were intercepted. Iran sent waves of slow-moving Shahed series loitering munitions alongside faster ballistic missiles. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate doctrine. The drones are cheap. Each one costs a fraction of what an interceptor missile costs. Each one that is shot down forces Israel to expend a far more expensive defensive asset. You do not need every drone to hit a target for the attack to be economically and militarily meaningful. You need to drain the magazine. You need to force the defender to burn through interceptors at a ratio that is simply unsustainable in a prolonged conflict. That is the calculation Iran made, and it is a calculation that Western defense planners have been quietly terrified about for years, because there is no easy answer to it. The cost-exchange ratio in this kind of warfare is brutal for the defending side. When an attacker can manufacture a drone for $10,000 and force the defender to fire a missile that costs $500,000 to bring it down, the attacker is winning economically even when they are losing tactically. Scale that up to hundreds of simultaneous projectiles and the math becomes genuinely alarming. The Iron Dome and its companion systems, David's Sling and Arrow, are genuinely impressive technological achievements. Israel has invested enormous resources and decades of engineering into layered air defense, and those systems performed. Interceptor rates in this engagement were high by any historical standard. But here is the question that does not get asked loudly enough in the mainstream coverage of these events. What happens in round two? What happens when Iran, or any adversary operating from the same playbook, simply does it again on a larger scale? Missile defense systems have finite inventories. The production lines that refill those inventories operate on timescales measured in months, not hours. Attrition in this kind of exchange does not favor the defender, and Iran demonstrated that it understands this with uncomfortable precision. The strategic logic is not about winning the first night. It is about establishing that the cost of continued confrontation is one the defender cannot sustain indefinitely. That is a fundamentally different kind of military pressure than anything Israel has faced from Iran in the past, and it requires a fundamentally different kind of strategic response. Now let us zoom out from the tactical to the strategic, because that is where this situation becomes truly consequential. Iran's decision to conduct a direct attack fundamentally altered the deterrence equation that has governed this region since the 1970s. For decades, Iran projected power through proxies: Hezbollah in Lebanon, various factions in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas in Gaza. This gave Iran what strategists call plausible deniability. It could create pressure, provoke responses, shape events, all while maintaining the fiction of distance. That fiction is now gone. Iran has placed itself in direct confrontation, and that changes everything about how every actor in the region calculates risk. The conversations happening right now in the defense ministries of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Turkey are not the same conversations that were happening 6 months ago. The threat model has changed, the escalation pathways have multiplied, and the assumptions that underpinned years of diplomatic and security planning have been stress-tested in public and found to be shakier than anyone wanted to admit. Consider the position Israel now occupies. Israel has always operated under the doctrine that it must maintain absolute military superiority over any combination of regional adversaries. That doctrine has served it well for 50 years. But that doctrine was designed for a threat environment that no longer fully exists. It was designed for state armies moving across borders, for tank columns and aircraft squadrons that could be tracked, targeted, and destroyed in detail. It was not designed at its core for the mass simultaneous employment of hundreds of low-cost precision munitions launched from a dispersed network that is extremely difficult to decapitate with preemptive strikes. The paradigm has shifted, and Israel, like every other military power in the world right now, is scrambling to adapt faster than the threat evolves. That is not a comfortable position to be in when the adversary across from you has had decades to refine exactly this approach and has now demonstrated publicly that it works. The American dimension of this crisis deserves serious examination because Washington's response, or more precisely the constraints on Washington's response, tells you a great deal about the limits of superpower projection in the current environment. The United States has maintained carrier strike groups in the region. It has prepositioned munitions, intelligence assets, and air power across multiple Gulf states. And yet the fundamental political reality is that direct American military action against Iran carries risks that the current administration, like the previous ones before it, is deeply reluctant to accept. A war with Iran is not a war with Iraq in 2003. Iran has the geographic and military depth to close the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, and even a partial closure of that waterway would send energy prices spiking across the globe within days. Iran has the missile inventory to credibly threaten every American base in the Gulf region simultaneously. It has relationships with armed groups across 5 countries that could open multiple fronts at the same time and force the United States to fight in several directions at once. The risk calculation is genuinely severe, and that constraint on American action is itself a major factor in how Iran made the decision to escalate. Tehran read the room. It concluded that the threat of American intervention, while real, was not unlimited, and it acted on that conclusion. What we are watching in real time is the collision between 2 fundamentally different models of military power. One model is the model built by the Western alliance over the past 30 years, centered around technological supremacy, precision strike capabilities, network-centric warfare, and the assumption that quality of systems will always overcome quantity of adversaries. The other model, increasingly refined and exported by Iran to its partners, is built around mass, attrition, redundancy, and the deliberate exploitation of the cost asymmetry that exists when cheap weapons force expensive defenses to respond continuously. Neither model is going to definitively win this competition quickly, but the fact that the second model is now performing at a level that genuinely stresses the first is one of the most important military strategic developments of the last decade, and this conflict has brought it into sharp public focus in a way that is impossible to dismiss or explain away. There is a broader regional dimension here that also cannot be ignored. Every government in the Middle East is watching how this plays out with intense and very careful interest. Saudi Arabia, which has conducted its own complicated diplomatic dance with Iran while simultaneously building ties with Israel, is recalibrating its threat assessments. The smaller Gulf states, which host American military infrastructure and have made significant moves toward regional normalization, are watching and quietly updating their own contingency plans. Turkey, which occupies a uniquely complex position as a NATO member with its own strategic ambitions and its own deeply ambivalent relationship with both Washington and Tel Aviv, is watching and calculating how events here affect its own leverage. And beyond the immediate region, Russia and China are watching an adversary of theirs, the United States, being tested in a theater where it cannot easily control outcomes. The message that Iran has sent is not just to Israel. It is to every actor in this system about the real cost of confrontation and the real limits of the security guarantees that have held this region together, however imperfectly, for the past several decades. For Israel specifically, the psychological dimension of this moment is profound in a way that military metrics alone simply do not capture. Israel's strategic identity has been built on the concept of deterrence, rooted in demonstrated capability, willingness to act, and the credible promise that the cost of attacking Israel will always exceed any conceivable benefit. That deterrence framework is now being tested in a new and more direct way than it has been before. The question is not whether Israel can retaliate against Iran. It clearly possesses that capability. The question is whether retaliation, however severe and however precise, actually restores deterrence in an environment where the adversary has already demonstrated both the willingness and the capacity to absorb enormous pressure and continue pressing forward. That is a harder and more uncomfortable question, and the honest answer is that nobody, including the most experienced strategic minds in this field, knows the answer with confidence right now. The escalation ladder in this conflict has more rungs than any previous iteration of the Iran-Israel confrontation, and the actors involved have different thresholds, different domestic political pressures, and fundamentally different calculations about what an acceptable outcome looks like. Iran has demonstrated capability and demonstrated will. Israel is under intense domestic pressure to demonstrate the same in return. The United States is trying simultaneously to prevent escalation and maintain its credibility as a security guarantor. And those two objectives are increasingly in tension with each other. Managing that tension while the situation continues to develop on the ground is perhaps the central challenge facing American foreign policy in this region right now. What I can tell you with confidence is that the old equilibrium is gone. The comfortable assumption that direct Iran-Israel confrontation was too costly for either side to risk has been shattered by the fact that Iran risked it and the world did not end immediately. That changes the expected value calculation for every future decision by every actor in the region. The threshold for what kinds of actions are considered too escalatory, too dangerous, too likely to trigger a catastrophic response has shifted. And when thresholds shift in volatile security environments, the margin for miscalculation shrinks dramatically. A miscalculation in this environment, given the military capabilities on all sides and the number of actors involved, could produce consequences that spiral far beyond anything any individual decision maker intended. That is the danger that should be generating the most serious concern right now, not just the specifics of what happened in this particular exchange, but what the willingness to conduct this exchange signals about what both sides believe is now permissible and survivable. The Middle East has entered a new and considerably more dangerous phase. The assumptions that governed a generation of security planning are broken. The doctrines need revision. The actors involved are making consequential real-time decisions under enormous pressure with incomplete information and domestic political constraints that do not always point toward restraint. If you want to understand how this unfolds, what the real military, political, and economic pressure points are, and how the decisions being made right now will shape the next decade in this region and beyond, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and stay with me. Because this story is nowhere near its conclusion, and in a situation this complex and this consequential, the details matter more than they ever have. Thank you for watching.